I had never heard of Daffodil Meadows before an old friend recommended it. I was nearing retirement from my job as a librarian in the city, eager for a quieter suburban life. The glossy brochure boasted idyllic streets named after flowers, a serene pond, and a welcoming community center. I craved the comfort and safety that a well-organized HOA supposedly offered. After years of chaotic living downtown, the thought of an orderly neighborhood appealed to me: neat lawns, consistent architecture, no glaring property disputes. Upon driving into Daffodil Meadows for the first time, I was enchanted by the rows of pastel-colored houses, each with matching fences and carefully pruned shrubs. A grand sign at the entrance read, "Daffodil Meadows, a place to bloom." That day, I had no inkling of the hidden cost of such uniformity. My new home was a modest, two-story townhouse on Marigold Court. Each building on that street held 4 units, connected by a small internal hallway. Some neighbors had front entrances that opened directly outside, while others, like me, shared a corridor. In all, the environment felt cozy yet communal. The shared hallway was well lit, carpeted in a soft floral pattern, large enough for a few neighbors to pass each other without jostling. On my first afternoon of unpacking, I spotted a tall, middle-aged woman with a sharply styled blonde bob walking my street with a clipboard. She wore a powder blue blouse and pressed slacks, exuding confidence. Spotting me, she approached. "Hello," she greeted. "I'm Karen Walden, the HOA president. I hope you've reviewed our guidelines. They keep the neighborhood pristine." She thrust a binder in my hands, titled Daffodil Meadows Covenants and Bylaws. I nodded politely, saying I'd peruse them. She gave a thin-lipped smile. "Excellent. We pride ourselves on order here. If you have questions, contact me directly." With that, she pivoted and moved on. I recall feeling slightly intimidated, but also relieved that the community was well managed. Little did I suspect the cruelty that this woman was capable of, or that she would soon target 2 elderly neighbors in a misguided obsession with a clear corridor. Over the next few weeks, I settled into my townhouse, enjoying the peace of Daffodil Meadows. My small porch overlooked a row of blooming daffodils planted by the HOA. The interior hallway that led to my front door was shared with 3 neighbors: Ms. Thornton, Mr. Kim, and Ms. Banks, an older woman who used a walker. On the floor above us lived another older resident, Mr. Rossi, also reliant on a walker after a hip surgery. I learned from Ms. Thornton that both Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi had been longtime residents who'd aged in place, cherishing their independence. Occasionally, I saw Ms. Banks shuffling in the corridor, leaning on her walker, a sweet smile on her face. She apologized if her walker partially obstructed the hallway, explaining that sometimes maneuvering it inside her small foyer was tough. Her steps were slow and careful. Mr. Rossi, likewise, lived alone upstairs and left his walker near the stairs sometimes while checking mail. The corridor was wide enough that their aides never truly blocked passage, maybe occupying a corner. None of us minded. The building had only 4 units, so minimal traffic. At random times, I'd notice Karen passing through the hall, presumably inspecting. She'd glance at Ms. Banks' walker with a slight frown, or scowl at Mr. Rossi's walker leaning by the upstairs landing. Once, I overheard her murmuring to Ms. Thornton about clutter in the hall. Ms. Thornton tried to clarify that the seniors needed space for their mobility aids, and it hardly caused inconvenience. Karen gave a dismissive shrug, saying, "Common areas must remain clear, or else it's a safety hazard." Ms. Thornton rolled her eyes after Karen left, whispering to me that Karen was notoriously rigid about eyesores or violations. Concern flickered in my mind. Would she actually try to enforce a ban on walkers? For now, Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi lived unperturbed, if slightly intimidated by Karen's presence. The rest of us shrugged it off. They had essential medical devices, so presumably the HOA would make allowances, right? But as I discover, Karen's mania for a pristine corridor trumped all else in her mind: common sense, compassion, even basic decency. Soon, she'd show just how far she'd go. One day, returning home from errands, I saw a bright pink notice pinned to the hallway bulletin board. Large bold letters read, "Corridor Safety and Clutter Prevention. All personal items, including but not limited to strollers, bikes, and walkers, must not be left unattended in the hallways. Violations will be subject to removal to maintain fire safety standards." Karen Walden, HOA President. My heart sank. Specifically naming walkers in the same category as bikes or strollers was alarming. This was no minor suggestion. Karen was effectively banning seniors from parking their mobility aids in the corridor, even briefly. I could imagine the strain on Ms. Banks or Mr. Rossi, forced to fold or store their walkers inside tight foyers. Ms. Banks' unit was tiny, and she struggled with lifting the walker's wheels over the threshold. That evening, Ms. Banks knocked on my door, tearful. I saw the new notice. How am I supposed to manage? I can't always carry my walker inside. Sometimes I need to rest in the hallway. But Karen says she'll confiscate it if it's left out. She worried about losing the device she depended on for mobility. I tried to console her, suggesting maybe she speak to Ms. Thornton or Mr. Kim about filing an exemption request. Ms. Banks said she'd approach Karen. Yet I doubted Karen's compassion. Mr. Rossi was similarly distressed. He told Ms. Thornton that climbing the stairs to his second-floor unit with a walker was tricky. He often left it at the base of the stairs, using the railing to ascend, then needed the walker at the top. The new notice threatened to remove any unattended walker. He felt singled out, anxious that if the walker disappeared, he'd be stranded. Some neighbors found the new rule nonsensical. We recognized potential fire hazard concerns, but the corridor was wide enough, and the building had 2 staircases plus an elevator. We saw no real hazard from a small walker near a door or landing. Yet Karen's posted notice was official-looking. Ms. Thornton asked if the entire board approved it. She discovered that, while the board had discussed hallway clutter, they hadn't specifically voted to ban medical aids. Karen apparently took it upon herself. Tension rose. The seniors felt threatened, but hoped Karen might relent once she saw how essential the walkers were. That hope was misplaced. The next week, Ms. Banks bravely approached Karen, politely explaining her mobility challenges. She described how sometimes she needed to rest in the corridor or momentarily park her walker near her door. She pleaded for a small exception. According to Ms. Banks, Karen responded curtly, "I'm sorry for your difficulty, but the corridor is not your storage closet. You must comply with safety regulations." Ms. Banks tried to mention the Americans with Disabilities Act or possible fair housing guidelines, but Karen brushed it off, insisting the HOA's common area rules overrode any such accommodations. Word of this encounter spread. Mr. Rossi, furious, drafted a letter to the board, stating that removing his walker from the stair landing would endanger his ability to safely ascend to his unit. Ms. Thornton and I supported him, signing as witnesses. However, the next day, we heard Karen telling Ms. Thornton, "I appreciate your concerns, but if the seniors cannot handle living independently without cluttering the halls, perhaps they should consider assisted living." That remark, dripping with callousness, shocked Ms. Thornton. She relayed it to me, and we were outraged. Karen's disregard for the elderly was blatant. Some neighbors began grumbling about Karen's overreach. Ms. Thornton discovered that the rest of the board only partially agreed about corridor tidiness. None wanted to forcibly remove walkers. But Karen, as president, claimed executive authority. She threatened to fine Ms. Banks or Mr. Rossi for each day a walker remained outside. The threat alone was stressful for them. Ms. Banks tearfully confided she might have to move if they forced her to keep the walker fully inside, as she physically struggled with that routine. It was heartbreaking seeing her independence at risk. I tried emailing the board collectively, explaining the seniors' plight. A few responded sympathetically, but none openly confronted Karen. She evidently intimidated them, or they feared conflict. Meanwhile, Ms. Thornton told me Ms. Banks had begun asking neighbors for short-term help carrying her walker, but that wasn't a sustainable solution. The tension thickened daily. We sensed Karen might do something drastic if we didn't find a resolution. Late one Friday afternoon, Returning home from errands, I passed Miss Banks in the corridor, leaning against the wall. She looked pale, muttering that she couldn't find her walker. It had been near her unit's door earlier in the day. Now it was gone. We searched the hallway, the trash rooms, the building's storage closet, no sign. Panicked, Miss Banks wondered if Karen had confiscated it. She tried knocking on Karen's door. Karen lived in a different building across the complex, but got no answer. Moments later, Miss Thornton rushed down from the second floor, exclaiming that Mr. Rossi's walker also vanished from the stair landing. Both elderly neighbors were now effectively stranded. Ms. Banks needed to retrieve medication from the pharmacy but could barely stand. Mr. Rossi was stuck upstairs, unable to descend safely. Neighbors were aghast. Did Karen truly remove and hide the walkers? Miss Thornton and I called the board members we knew. Most had no clue. Ms. Jenkins, one board member, said Karen hadn't mentioned taking them. But Ms. Jenkins had seen Karen pushing a cart through the corridor earlier, around the time the walkers disappeared. We confronted Karen's phone line with repeated calls, no response. Some neighbors proposed we check the building's basement or the association's storage areas. We found them locked. Others suggested maybe Karen tossed them in a dumpster or donated them. Horror rose at that possibility. That evening, Miss Banks was forced to borrow a cane from Miss Thornton to move around. Mr. Rossi's daughter, who lived out of state, was furious upon hearing the news. She phoned Miss Jenkins, threatening legal action if the walker wasn't returned. Tension soared. Miss Thornton and I realized this might cross from an HOA squabble into the realm of actual elder abuse or criminal theft. After all, forcibly removing a mobility aid from seniors can endanger their lives. Miss Thornton proposed calling the police, but we decided to see if the HOA could rectify it first. Meanwhile, Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi were in dire straits. The next morning, Ms. Jenkins, acting on neighbors' pleas, unlocked the basement utility room. Inside, we found a large pile of miscellaneous items that Karen had apparently seized from violators, old bikes, a few plant stands, and, to our horror, Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi's walkers tossed in a corner. Their frames were scratched, the wheels entangled. Ms. Jenkins gasped, calling it unbelievable cruelty. She snapped photos, planning to show the rest of the board. We carefully extracted the walkers. Ms. Banks' walker had a bent wheel, presumably from rough handling. Mr. Rossi's had a cracked plastic grip. Ms. Jenkins and I agreed to deliver them back to the owners immediately. Ms. Jenkins insisted the HOA had no policy to store items in the utility room like that. This was entirely Karen's doing. She must have broken in with her master key, hauling the walkers away. The seniors' families were furious upon learning how carelessly they were treated. Ms. Jenkins confronted Karen in person that afternoon. According to Ms. Jenkins, Karen admitted placing the walkers there, calling them illegal corridor obstructions. She insisted she had every right to remove them under emergency safety powers. Ms. Jenkins retorted that the board never granted such powers, nor did the bylaw mention forcibly removing medical aids. Karen shrugged, stating the seniors repeatedly violated corridor rules, ignoring her pink notices. Ms. Jenkins found it appalling that Karen equated vital mobility devices with general clutter. Word spread like wildfire. Residents erupted in outrage that Karen had unilaterally kidnapped two seniors' walkers, damaging them in the process. Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi pressed Ms. Jenkins to convene an emergency board meeting. Some demanded Karen's immediate resignation. Others spoke of potential lawsuits for endangering elders. Karen, meanwhile, remained defiant, insisting she was protecting the building from hazards. The tension soared to a fever pitch, overshadowing everyday life in Daffodil Meadows. The families of Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi discovered how precarious their loved ones' situations had become. Both elderly neighbors were traumatized by the forced removal of their walkers, which left them vulnerable. Ms. Rossi's daughter visited from 2 states away, threatening to press charges for elder abuse if the HOA didn't rectify the matter. Ms. Banks' niece, a retired nurse, recognized the seriousness. Taking away mobility aids is a direct threat to seniors' well-being. This is no small offense. It's borderline criminal. Ms. Jenkins tried to mitigate the crisis, apologizing on behalf of the HOA, but Karen refused to back down. She wrote an email to the entire membership, claiming the corridor must remain free of any obstructions and that the seniors had ample warnings. She portrayed them as neglecting to store their walkers properly. The email contained no empathy, only references to her legal duty under fire code compliance. This incensed neighbors further. We pointed out that small items near a door hardly constituted a fire hazard, especially for necessary medical aids. In frustration, Ms. Banks' niece contacted the county's Elder Protective Services. She relayed how Karen had confiscated the seniors' walkers, leaving them effectively housebound, and how they both suffered. EPS agents promised to investigate. Meanwhile, Ms. Rossi's daughter threatened to contact a lawyer specializing in elder law. Tension soared. Ms. Jenkins, an ally, admitted that no single board member had the authority to remove items forcibly without due process or any hearing. Karen was clearly acting beyond her mandate. Sensing the impending storm, Ms. Jenkins scheduled an emergency HOA board meeting for the following week, inviting all homeowners. The main agenda: review of corridor item removal and official policy regarding medical devices. Everyone expected a fierce showdown, Karen defending her actions, Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi's families demanding accountability. Elder Protective Services hinted they'd attend or send a representative. We braced for an explosive evening that might determine Karen's fate and the seniors' rights. The community center was packed to capacity on the night of the emergency board meeting. Residents who rarely engaged in HOA politics showed up, drawn by the shocking allegations that Karen forcibly removed elderly neighbors' walkers. Ms. Jenkins sat at the board table with 3 other members. Karen, as president, sat at the center, looking tense but determined. After a few formalities, Ms. Jenkins introduced the main topic: unilateral removal of essential medical aids from the corridor, leading to potential harm of 2 senior residents, Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi. She reminded everyone that no official board vote authorized Karen to confiscate or store these devices. Ms. Banks, assisted by her niece, rose to speak, voice trembling with emotion. She recounted how humiliating it was to find her walker gone, how she nearly fell multiple times. Mr. Rossi's daughter spoke next, describing her father's vulnerability and the mental distress inflicted. Karen responded with a stiff statement about protecting the building from corridor obstructions, claiming a legal mandate to keep egress paths clear. She insisted she'd posted warnings, that the seniors refused to follow directions. She expressed zero remorse, focusing on fire code compliance. The crowd murmured disapproval. Ms. Jenkins countered that the building had wide hallways, no official record of complaints, and no code official had mandated removing mobility aids. She read from the local housing guidelines, referencing an exception for medical devices under fair housing and disability accommodation laws. The audience erupted in applause. Then an Elder Protective Services agent, Ms. Lopez, stepped forward. She announced that EPS had received a formal complaint. Removing mobility aids from older adults without consent, leaving them at risk, could be classified as neglect or even abuse, depending on state statutes. She cautioned that if the board condoned Karen's actions, the HOA might face legal consequences. The audience collectively gasped. Ms. Jenkins assured Ms. Lopez that the board had not condoned it at all. Karen tried to shift blame, insisting the seniors could store their walkers inside. Ms. Lopez shot back that forcing a physically challenged individual to lift or maneuver a walker inside might be impractical or unsafe, thus requiring a small accommodation. Karen's face tightened. A wave of indignation rippled through the crowd. Mr. Rossi, speaking quietly, said, "I can't carry my walker upstairs without risking a fall. You left me powerless for days." The hush that followed was thick with moral outrage. A mess. Jenkins then made a motion to condemn Karen's unilateral removal of the walkers as unauthorized and harmful. Another board member, Mr. Alvarez, seconded it, calling for a censure. The board voted 4-1 in favor, with Karen alone dissenting. Applause thundered. But Ms. Jenkins hinted more severe measures might be needed if the membership demanded Karen's resignation. Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi's families pressed for restitution. Karen had damaged the walkers, and Ms. Banks' walker needed replacing. The meeting concluded with the board pledging immediate policy changes to explicitly allow necessary mobility aids in corridors. Karen stormed out, ignoring calls for her to apologize. In the aftermath, the entire Daffodil Meadows community buzzed with condemnation of Karen's actions. Even residents who once tolerated her strict approach to landscaping or parking saw this as crossing a moral line. Many posted on the HOA's online forum, demanding she step down. Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi's families threatened legal action if she continued in any leadership capacity. Meanwhile, Ms. Jenkins scheduled a special membership meeting to discuss a possible recall vote on Karen's presidency. Karen, for her part, doubled down on her safety rationale. She emailed the association a lengthy screed about fire hazards, clutter, and refusal to abide by warnings. The blowback was immediate. Residents pointed out that she specifically targeted these seniors' walkers, ignoring other items occasionally left in hallways, like delivery boxes, strollers, which she never confiscated. The hypocrisy was glaring. Some suspected her real motive was an irrational obsession with neatness, overshadowing human needs. Others whispered about an underlying ageist attitude, as if she resented the presence of older, less mobile neighbors. Ms. Jenkins worked swiftly with Ms. Lopez from EPS, clarifying the new corridor policy. Small mobility aids were permitted outside an older resident's door if needed for safe movement. The board wrote a formal letter apologizing to Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi, guaranteeing no further interference. They also mandated Karen repay any repair or replacement costs for the damaged walkers. Ms. Banks, relieved, told me she'd never felt so supported by neighbors, even as the memory of Karen's cruelty haunted her. A recall petition circulated, swiftly gathering signatures from at least half the community. Ms. Jenkins announced the recall meeting in 2 weeks. Karen tried rallying a small faction of rule lovers, but the majority recognized the seriousness of her offense. Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi's families wrote heartfelt pleas to neighbors, describing how close their loved ones had been to dangerous falls or complete isolation. The moral weight of harming elders overshadowed any claim of fire code compliance. Even many who once admired Karen for keeping the neighborhood nice now turned their backs on her. On the day of the recall meeting, the Daffodil Meadows Community Center overflowed with residents. The board sat at the front, Ms. Jenkins as vice president, Mr. Alvarez, Ms. Cho, Mr. Patterson, and Karen. The membership lined the chairs in tense anticipation. A hush fell as Ms. Jenkins opened the floor, explaining the recall process. The question, should Karen Walden remain HOA president or be removed? Karen was granted time to defend herself. She read a statement about how she only followed the bylaws to keep corridors safe, bemoaning that her efforts were misinterpreted. She insisted no personal malice toward the seniors. Ms. Jenkins then summarized the timeline. Karen posted unilateral rules banning walkers, confiscated Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi's aides, stored them in the basement without the board's knowledge, causing distress and endangerment. She highlighted how EPS labeled it potential elder neglect. Then the seniors' family spoke, recounting how Ms. Banks nearly fell multiple times, how Mr. Rossi was stranded upstairs. The crowd listened, shocked and enraged. At last, Ms. Jenkins called for a vote, distributing yes/no ballots. Shall Karen Walden be removed from her position as HOA president? The tension was thick. Volunteers collected the ballots, retreated to count. Karen sat rigidly, face pinched, ignoring the murmurs. Ms. Banks, seated near the front with her walker at her side, whispered thanks to Ms. Jenkins for standing up for them. After a seemingly endless half-hour, the volunteers returned. Ms. Jenkins read the result. Of the valid ballots cast, 185 in favor of removal, 37 opposed. The motion to remove Karen Walden passes by a large margin. Applause and cheers erupted. Some shouted, "Justice." Others glared at Karen. Miss Jenkins hammered the gavel, announcing Karen's immediate removal from the presidency. Effective that night, Miss Jenkins became interim president. Karen, pale and trembling with anger, pushed through the crowd, ignoring demands for an apology. Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi wept tears of relief. Their families embraced them. The membership meeting ended with a collective sense that justice was done. The corridor fiasco taught them all that no HOA official could ride roughshod over seniors' rights. Karen's reign had ended in disgrace. With Karen dethroned, Ms. Jenkins and the rest of the board wasted no time enacting clearer guidelines for corridor usage, ensuring reasonable accommodations for residents with medical needs. They published a statement apologizing for the stress caused by Karen's unilateral actions. Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi felt vindicated, and Ms. Banks's niece decided not to pursue legal charges, satisfied that Karen was removed and the community was now supportive. Elder Protective Services closed their case, noting the resolution, new leadership in place, a vow to accommodate seniors properly. However, EPS kept a record of Karen's wrongdoing, labeling it a serious incident of potential elder neglect. Karen's final punishment was thus removal from HOA presidency via a decisive membership recall. Official censure by the board for reckless and harmful behavior. Financial penalty, she was mandated to reimburse Ms. Banks for repairs to her bent walker and possibly pay for Mr. Rossi's partial replacement. Public disgrace. The entire neighborhood recognized her cruelty, ostracizing her socially. Though not prosecuted criminally, Karen's reputation lay in tatters. She remained a homeowner, but no longer possessed any authority. Many neighbors refused to greet her politely. Some asked if she planned to move, but no listing appeared. Perhaps she opted to remain, forced to live among those who condemned her actions. Ms. Jenkins told me Karen's presence at any future meeting would carry no weight. She was effectively powerless. As the weeks passed, Ms. Banks used her walker openly, free from intimidation. Mr. Rossi left his walker near the stair landing, unafraid it might vanish. Neighbors occasionally offered a friendly hand if they needed help. Freed from Karen's oppression, the corridor became a place of mutual support rather than tension. The fiasco left a permanent lesson that an HOA's mission to maintain order must never override compassion and respect for vulnerable residents. In the months after Karen's removal, Daffodil Meadows underwent a positive shift. The new HOA leadership under Ms. Jenkins revisited some of Karen's draconian rules, ensuring they aligned with fair housing and disability rights. They created a resident accommodation committee, with Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi's families consulting on how best to support older or disabled neighbors. The corridor fiasco became a cautionary tale. If an HOA official can't balance safety with empathy, the community must rise up and enforce accountability. Ms. Banks, blossoming with renewed confidence, joined a crocheting club in the community center. Mr. Rossi began volunteering to teach a short language class once a week, using his walker proudly, never again forced to hide it. The rest of us found relief from Karen's meddling. Freed from her hawkish patrols, we felt more at ease. Karen's presence in the neighborhood was rarely seen. Some claimed to spot her driving away in the early mornings, avoiding interactions. The board never invited her to official gatherings. She had lost her seat, her prestige, and the respect of neighbors. The fiasco with the walkers overshadowed any positives she once contributed. Ms. Jenkins told me that, ironically, Karen had once championed community unity, but her obsession with tidiness had led her to commit an act close to elder abuse. Though Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi occasionally flinched, recalling how vulnerable they'd been, they were heartened by the wave of neighborly compassion that emerged. Ms. Banks's niece crocheted a bright, colorful pouch for Ms. Banks's walker, making it not only functional, but stylish, a small victory of self-expression over sterile uniformity. Observing them roam the corridor unimpeded brought joy to many. We realized how easy it is for the needs of the vulnerable to be trampled by petty rules. The entire fiasco hammered home the principle that an HOA's job is to serve the community, not terrorize it. One Saturday morning, Miss Thornton hosted a casual breakfast gathering in the lounge. Residents came to share pastries and chat about daily life. Ms. Banks arrived, walker in tow, greeting everyone warmly. Mr. Rossi joined from upstairs, also with his walker. The conversation turned to the events of the past few months. People shook their heads at how close they'd come to allowing one official, Karen, to undermine the seniors' independence. Ms. Banks voiced gratitude that the community rallied behind them. Mr. Rossi nodded, calling it a blessing in disguise, for it awakened empathy among neighbors. I recall stepping out onto the courtyard after that breakfast, gazing at the gentle morning sun lighting the rows of daffodils. The entire environment felt more relaxed, more genuine than when Karen patrolled with a clipboard. Freed from her scrutiny, the neighborhood's warmth surfaced in small acts of kindness, checking on older neighbors, assisting with groceries, or simply offering a friendly greeting. Meanwhile, rumors suggested Karen was preparing to sell her townhouse quietly. Some saw a for sale sign pop up late at night, only for it to vanish the next day. Others suspected she might remain, but in a self-imposed exile, ashamed to appear in public events where she was known as the Walker Thief. In truth, the final outcome was immaterial. The HOA moved forward, guided by Ms. Jenkins's leadership and a reinforced sense of decency. They knew never to let another official replicate Karen's cruelty. Thus ends the saga of how Karen Walden, the once powerful HOA president of Daffodil Meadows, tried to keep a corridor clear by disposing of two elderly neighbors walking aids, oblivious to the severity of her deed. In her single-minded pursuit of aesthetic order, she violated the dignity and safety of Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi, committing an act so brazenly heartless that the entire community rose against her. Elder Protective Services labeled her deed as potential abuse. The HOA board censured her. Ultimately, she faced her punishment: removal from office, social ostracism, and a permanent stain on her reputation. In the aftermath, Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi reclaimed their freedom to navigate the hallway without fear of confiscation. Their families, once outraged, now felt vindicated, grateful for the neighbors' swift solidarity. The new leadership under Ms. Jenkins championed a more inclusive, caring approach, ensuring medical aids and other necessary items for seniors were permitted with minimal fuss. A wave of empathy permeated Daffodil Meadows, strengthening communal bonds in a way no top-down rule ever could. Karen, stripped of her authority, faded into the background, forced to confront the reality that her disregard for the vulnerable had cost her everything. She remained a resident, but no longer the puppet master of corridor aesthetics. Her final punishment, in many ways, was to live among people who recognized her cruelty and no longer feared her. Meanwhile, the corridor she once policed so obsessively became a symbol of compassion, a space for neighbors to meet and support each other. In that corridor, Ms. Banks and Mr. Rossi walked, unimpeded, unafraid, a testament that common humanity will triumph when a community stands against petty tyranny.